Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Ayaz Afsa and our topic today is Structuralism and Literary Analysis. Structuralism has its origins in New Criticism. New Criticism had done its job well, but it was in a sense too modest and particularist to qualify as a hard-nosed academic discipline. In its obsessive concentration on the isolated literary text, its delicate nurturings of sensibility, it had tended to leave aside the broader, more structural aspects of literature. What had happened to literary history? What was needed was a literary theory which, while preserving the formalist bent of New Criticism, its dogged attention to literature as aesthetic object rather than social practice, would make something a good deal more systematic and scientific out of all this. The answer arrived in 1957 in the shape of the Canadian Northrop Frye's mighty totalization of all literary genres, Anatomy of Criticism. Frye's belief was that criticism was in a sorry, unscientific mess and needed to be smartly tidied up. It was a matter of subjective value judgments and idle gossip, and badly required the discipline of an objective system. This was possible, Frye held, because literature itself formed such a system. It was not, in fact, just a random collection of writings strewn throughout history. If you examine it closely, you could see that it worked by certain objective laws, and criticism could itself become systematic by formulating them. These laws were the various modes, archetypes, myths, and genres by which all literary works were structured. At the root of all literature lay four narrative categories: the comic, romantic, tragic, and ironic, which could be seen to correspond respectively to the four mythi of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. A theory of literary modes could be outlined, whereby in myth the hero is superior in kind to others, in romance superior in degree, in the high mimetic modes of tragedy and epic superior in degree to others but not to his environment, in the low mimetic modes of comedy and realism equal to the rest of us, and in satire and irony it is inferior. Tragedy and comedy can be subdivided into high mimetic, low mimetic, and ironic. Tragedy is about human isolation, comedy about human integration. Three recurrent patterns of symbolism, the apocalyptic, demonic, and analogical, are identified. The whole system can then be put into motion as a cyclical theory of literary history. Literature passes from myth to irony and then reverts to myth, and in 1957 we were evidently somewhere in the ironic phase with signs of an impending return to the mythic. To establish his literary system, of which the above is only a partial account, Frye must first of all clear value judgments out of the way. Since these are merely subjective noises. When we analyze literature, we are speaking of literature. When we evaluate it, we are speaking of ourselves. The system must also expel any history other than literary history. Literary works are made out of other literary works, not out of any material external to the literary system itself. The advantage of Fry's theory, then, is that it keeps literature untainted by history in new critical fashion, viewing it as an enclosed ecological recycling of text, but unlike new criticism, finds in literature a substitute history with all the global span and collective structures of history itself. The modes and myths of literature are trans-historical, collapsing history to sameness, or a set of repetitive variations on the same themes. For the system to survive, it must be kept rigorously closed. Nothing external can be allowed to infiltrate it lest its categories are deranged. This is why Fry's scientific impulse demands a formalism even more full-blooded than that of new criticism. The new critic allowed that literature was in some significant sense cognitive, yielding a sort of knowledge of the world. Fry insists that literature is an autonomous verbal structure, quite cut off from any reference before itself or beyond itself, a sealed and inward-looking realm which contains life and reality in a system of verbal relationships. All the system ever does is reshuffle its symbolic units in relation to each other rather than in relation to any kind of reality outside it. Literature is not a way of knowing reality, but a kind of collective utopian dreaming which has gone on throughout history, an expression of those fundamental human desires which have given rise to civilization itself, but which are never fully satisfied there. It is not to be seen as the self-expression of individual authors who are no more than functions of this universal system. It springs from the collective subject of the human race itself, which is how it comes to embody archetypes or figures of universal significance. Fry's work emphasizes, as it does, the utopian root of literature because it is marked by a deep fear of the actual social world, a distaste for history itself. Like several of the literary theorists, Fry offers literature as a displaced version of religion. Literature becomes an essential palliative for the failure of religious ideology and supplies us with various myths which are of relevance to social life. In The Critical Path, published in 1971, Fry contrasts conservative myths of concern with liberal myths of freedom and desires an equable balance between the two. The authoritarian tendencies of conservatism must be corrected by myths of freedom, while a conservative sense of order must temper liberalism's tendencies to social irresponsibility. What the mighty mythological system from Homer to the kingdom of God comes down to, in short, is a position somewhere between liberal Republican and conservative Democrat. The only mistake, Fry informs us, is that of the revolutionary, who naively misinterprets myths of freedom as historically realizable goals. Myths of freedom as historically realizable goals. The revolutionary is just a bad critic, mistaking myth for reality as a child might mistake the actress for a real fairy princess. It is remarkable that literature, served from any sordid practical concern as it is in the end more or less capable of telling us which way to vote. Fry stands in the liberal humanist tradition of Arnold, desiring, as he says, society as free, classless and urban. What he means by classless, like Arnold before him, is in effect a society which universally subscribes to his own middle-class liberal values. There is a loose sense in which Northrop Frye's work can be described as structuralist, and it is significantly contemporary with the growth of classical structuralism in Europe. Structuralism, as the term suggests, is concerned with structures, and more particularly with examining the general laws by which they work. It also, like Fry, tends to reduce individual phenomena to mere instances of such laws. But structuralism proper contains a distinctive doctrine which is not to be found in Fry, the belief that the individual units of any system have meaning only by virtue of their relations to one another. This does not allow from a simple belief that you should look at things structurally. You can examine a poem as a structure while still treating each of its items as more or less meaningful in itself. Perhaps the poem contains one image about the sun and another about the moon, and you are interested in how these two images fit together to form a structure. But you become a card-carrying structuralist only when you claim that the meaning of each image is wholly a matter of its relation to the other. The images do not have a substantial meaning, only a relational one. You do not need to go outside the poem to what you know of suns and moons to explain them. They explain and define each other. Let me try to illustrate this by a simple example. Suppose we are analyzing a story in which a boy leaves home after quarreling with his father, sets out on a walk through the forest in the heat of the day, and falls down a deep pit. The father comes out in search of his son, peers down the pit, but is unable to see him because of the darkness. At that moment, the sun has risen to a point directly overhead, illuminates the pit's depth with its rays, and allows the father to rescue his child. After a joyous reconciliation, they return home together. This may not be a particularly gripping narrative, but it has the advantage of simplicity. Clearly, it could be interpreted in all sorts of ways. A psychoanalytical critic might detect definite hints of the Oedipus complex in it, and show how the child's fall into the pit is a punishment he unconsciously wishes upon himself for the rift with his father. Perhaps a form of symbolic castration or a symbolic recourse to his mother's womb. A humanist critic might read it as a poignant dramatization of the difficulties implicit in human relationships. Another kind of critic might see it as an extended, rather pointless wordplay on son, S-O-N, and S-U-N. What a structuralist critic would do would be to schematize the story in a diagrammatic form. The first unit of signification, boy quarrels with father, might be rewritten as love rebels against high. The boy's walk through the forest is a movement along a horizontal axis. In contrast to the vertical axis, low and high, and could be indexed as middle, the fall into the pit, a place below ground, signifies low again, and the zenith of the sun, high. By shining into the pit, the sun has, in a sense, stooped low, thus inverting the narrative's first signifying unit, where low struck against high. The reconciliation between father and son restores an equilibrium between low and high, and the walk back home together, signifying middle, marks this achievement of a suitably intermediate state. Flushed with triumph, the structuralist rearranges his rules and reaches for the next story. What is notable about this kind of analysis is that, like formalism, it brackets off the actual content of the story and concentrates entirely on the form. You could replace father and son, pit and son, with entirely different elements, mother and daughter, bird and mole, and still have the same story. As long as the structure of relations between the units is preserved, it does not matter which items you select. This is not the case with the psychoanalytical or humanist readings of the tale, which depend on these items having a certain intrinsic significance to understand which we have to resort to our knowledge of the world outside the text. Of course, there is a sense in which the sun is high and pits are low anyway, and to that extent what is chosen as content does matter. But if we took a narrative structure in which what was required was the symbolic role of mediator between two items, the mediator could be anything from a grasshopper to a waterfall. The relations between the various items of the story may be ones of parallelism, opposition, inversion, equivalence, and so on. And as long as the structure of internal relations remains intact, the individual units are replaceable. Three other points may be noted about the method. First, it does not matter to structuralism that this story is hardly an example of great literature. The method is quiet, indifferent to the cultural value of its object. Anything from war and peace to the war cry will do. The method is analytical, not evaluative. Second, structuralism is a calculated affront to common sense. It refuses the obvious meaning of the story and seeks instead to isolate certain deep structures within it which are not apparent on the surface. It does not take the text at face value, but displaces it into a quite different kind of object. Third, if the particular contents of the text are replaceable, there is a sense in which one can say that the content of the narrative is its structure. This is equivalent to claiming that the narrative is in a way about itself. Its subject is its own internal relations, its own modes of sense-making. Literary structuralism flourished in the 1960s as an attempt to apply to literature the methods and insights of the founder of modern structural linguistics, Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure viewed language as a system of signs, which was to be studied synchronically, that is to say, studied as a complete system at a given point in time, rather than diachronically in its historical development. Each sign was to be seen as being made up of a signifier, a sound image, or its graphic equivalent, and a signified, the concept or meaning. The three black marks CAT are a signifier which evoke the signified cat in an English mind. The relation between signifier and signified is an arbitrary one. There is no inherent reason why these three marks should mean cat other than cultural and historical convention. Contrast cat in French, C-H-A-T, or chat. The relation between the whole sign and what it refers to, what Saussure calls the referent, the real furry, four-legged creature, is therefore also arbitrary. Each sign in the system has meaning only by virtue of its difference from the others. Cat has meaning not in itself, but because it is not cap or cad or bat. It doesn't matter how the signifier alters. It does not matter how the signifier alters as long as it preserves its difference from all the other signifiers. You can pronounce it in many different accents as long as this difference is maintained. In the linguistic system, says Saussure, there are only differences. Meaning is not mysteriously immanent in a sign, but is functional, the result of its difference from other signs. Finally, Saussure believed that linguistics would get into a hopeless mess if it concerned itself with actual speech, or parole as he called it. He was not interested in investigating what people actually said. He was concerned with the objective structure of signs which made their speech possible in the first place, and this he called Lang. Neither was socio concerned with the real objects which people spoke about. In order to study language effectively, the reference of the signs, the things they actually denoted, had to be placed in brackets. Structuralism in general is an attempt to apply this linguistic theory to objects and activities other than language itself. You can view a myth, wrestling match, system of tribal kinship, restaurant menu, or oil painting as a system of signs, and a structuralist analysis will try to isolate the underlying set of laws by which these signs are combined into meanings. It will largely ignore what the signs actually say and concentrate instead on their internal relations to one another. Structuralism, as Frederick Jameson has put it, is an attempt to rethink everything through once again in terms of linguistics. It is a system of the fact that language, with its problems, mysteries and implications, has become both paradigm and obsession for 20th century intellectual life. Socio's linguistic views influenced the Russian formalists, although formalism is not itself exactly a structuralism. It views literary texts structurally and suspends attention to the referent to examine the sign itself. But it is not particularly concerned with meaning as differential, or in much of its work with the deep laws and structures underlying literary texts. It was one of the Russian formalists, however, the linguist Roman Jakobson, who was to provide the major link between formalism and modern-day structuralism. Jakobson was leader of the Moscow Linguistic Circle, a formalist group founded in 1915 and in 1920 migrated to Prague to become one of the major theoreticians of Czech structuralism. The Prague Linguistic Circle was founded in 1926 and survived until the outbreak of the Second World War. Jakobson later migrated once more, this time to the United States, where he encountered the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss during the Second World War, an intellectual relationship out of which much of modern structuralism was to develop. Jakobson's influence can be detected everywhere within formalism, Czech structuralism, and modern linguistics. What he contributed in particular to poetics, which he regarded as part of the field of linguistics, was the idea that the poetic consisted above all in language being placed in a certain kind of self-conscious relationship to itself. The poetic functioning of language promotes palpability of signs, draws attention to their material qualities rather than simply using them as counters in communication. In the poetic, the sign is dislocated from its object. The usual relation between sign and referent is disturbed, which allows the sign a certain independence as an object of value in itself. All communications for Jacobson involves 6 elements: an addresser, an addressee, a message passed between them, a shared code which makes that message intelligible, a context, a physical medium of communication, and a context to which the message refers. Any one of these elements may dominate in a particular communicative act. Language seen from the addresser's viewpoint is emotive or expressive of a state of mind. From the addressee's standpoint, it is conative or trying for an effect. If communication concerns the context, it is referential. If it is oriented to the code itself, it is metalinguistic, as when two individuals discuss whether they are understanding each other. And communication angled towards the context itself is phatic. For example, well, here we are chatting away at last, or two people at the bus station saying, what's the weather like? And the other says, oh, it's nice today. The poetic function is dominant when the communication focuses on the message itself, when the words themselves, rather than what is said by whom, for what purpose, in what situation, are foregrounded in our attention. Jacobson also makes much of a distinction implicit in socios between the metaphorical and the metonymic. In metaphor, one sign is substituted for another because it is somehow similar to it. Passion becomes flame. In metonymy, one sign is associated with another. Wing is associated with aircraft because it is part of it. Sky with aircraft because of physical contiguity. We can make metaphors because we have a series of signs which are equivalent: passion, flame, love, and so on. When we speak or write, we select signs from a possible range of equivalencies and then combine them together to form a sentence. What happens in poetry? What happens in poetry, however, is that we pay attention to equivalencies in the process of combining words together as well as in selecting them. We string together words which are semantically or rhythmically or phonetically or in some other way equivalent. This is why Jacobson is able to say in a famous definition that the poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection to the axis of combination. The Prague School of Linguistics, Jacobson, Jan Makowski, Felix Wodica, and others represent a kind of transition from formalism to modern structuralism. They elaborated the ideas of the formalists but systematized them more firmly within the framework of Saussurian linguistics. Poems were to be viewed as functional structures in which signifiers and signifieds are governed by a single complex set of relations. These signs must be studied in their own right, not as reflections of an external reality. Social stress and the arbitrary relations between sign and referent, word and thing help to detach the text from its surroundings and make of it an autonomous object. Yet the literary work was still related to the world by the formalist concept of defamiliarization. Art estranges and undermines conventional sign systems, compels our attention to the material processes of language itself, and so renews our perceptions. In not taking language for granted, we are also transforming our consciousness. More than the formalists, however, the Czech structuralists insisted on the structural unity of the work. Its elements were to be grasped as functions of a dynamic whole with one particular level of the text, what the Prague school called the dominant, acting as the determining influence which deformed or pulled into its own field of force all the others. With the work of the Prague school, the term structuralism comes more or less to merge with the word semiotics. Semiotics or semiology means the systematic study of signs, and this is what literary structuralists are really doing. The word structuralism itself indicates a method of inquiry which can be applied to a whole range of objects, from football matches to economic modes of production. Semiotics denotes rather a particular field of study, that of systems which would in an ordinary sense be regarded as signs. Poems, bird calls, traffic lights, medical symptoms, and so on. But the two words overlap, since structuralism treats something which may not usually be thought of as a system of signs as though it were. The kinship relations of tribal societies, for example, while semiotics commonly uses structuralist methods. The American founder of semiotics, the philosopher C.S. Peirce, distinguished between three basic kinds of sign. There was the iconic, where the sign somehow resembled what it stood for, a photograph of a person, for example. The indexical, in which the sign is somehow associated with what it is a sign of, smoke with fire, spots with measles. And the symbolic, where, as with socio, the sign is only arbitrary, or arbitrarily or conventionally linked with its referent. Semiotics takes up this and many other classifications. It distinguishes between denotation, what the sign stands for, and connotation, other signs associated with it, between codes, the rule governs structures which produce meanings, and the messages transmitted by them, between the paradigmatic, a whole class of signs which may stand in for one another, and the syntagmatic, where signs are coupled together with each other in a chain. It speaks of meta-language, where one sign system denotes another sign system. The relation between literary criticism and literature, for instance. polysemic signs which have more than one meaning, and a great many other technical concepts. To see what this kind of analysis looks like in practice, we may briefly consider the work of the leading Soviet semiotician of the so-called school of Tartu, Yuri Lotman. In his works, The Structure of the Artistic Text, published in 1970, and The Analysis of the Poetic Text, published in 1972, Lotman sees the poetic text as a stratified system in which meaning only exists contextually, governed by sets of similarities and oppositions. Differences and parallelisms in the text are themselves relative terms and can only be perceived in relation to one another. In poetry, it is the nature of the signifier, the patterns of sound and rhythm set up by the marks on the page themselves which determines what is signified. A poetic text is semantically saturated, condensing more information than any other discourse. But whereas for modern communication theory in general, an increase in information leads to a decrease in communication. Since I cannot take in all that you so intensively tell me. This is not so in poetry because of its unique kind of internal organization. Poetry has a minimum of redundancy of those signs which are present in a discourse to facilitate communication rather than convey information, but still manages to produce a richer set of messages than any other form of language. Poems are bad when they do not carry sufficient information. For as Lotman remarks, information is beauty. Every literary text is made up of a number of systems, lexical, graphic, metrical, phonological, and so on, and gains its effect through constant clashes and tensions between these systems. Each of the systems comes to represent a norm from which the others deviate, setting up a code of expectations which they transgress. Meter, for example, creates a certain pattern which the poem's syntax may cut across and violate. In this way, each system in the text defamiliarizes the others, breaking up their regularity and throwing them into more vivid relief. Our perception of the poem's grammatical structure, for example, may heighten our awareness of its meanings. Just as one of the poem's systems threatens to become too predictable, another cuts across it to disrupt it into new life. If two words are associated together because of their similar sound or position in the metrical scheme, this will produce a sharper awareness of their similarity or difference of meaning. The literary work continually enriches and transforms mere dictionary meaning, generating new significances by the clash and condensation of its various levels. And since any two words whatsoever may be juxtaposed on the basis of some equivalent feature, this possibility is more or less unlimited. Each word in the context is linked by a whole set of formal structures to several other words, and its meaning is thus always overdetermined, always the result of several different determinants acting together. An individual word may relate to another word through assonance, to another through syntactical equivalence, to yet another through morphological parallelism, and so on. Each sign thus participates in several different paradigmatic patterns or systems simultaneously, and this complexity is greatly compounded by the syntagmatic chains of association, the lateral rather than vertical structures in which signs are placed. The poetic text for Lotman is thus a system of systems, a relation of relations. It is the most complex form of discourse imaginable, condensing together several systems, each of which contains its own tensions, parallelisms, repetitions, and oppositions, and each of which is continually modifying all of the others. A poem, in fact, can only be reread, not read, since some of its structures can only be perceived retrospectively. Poetry activates the full body of the signifier, presses the word to work to its utmost under the intense pressure of surrounding words, and so to release its richest potential. Whatever we perceive in the text is perceived only by contrast and difference, an element which had no differential relation to any other would remain invisible. Even the absence of certain devices may produce meaning. If the codes which the work has generated lead us to expect a rhyme or a happy ending which does not materialize, this minus device, as Lotman terms it, may be as effective a unit of meaning as any other. The literary work, indeed, is a continual generating and violating of expectations, a complex interplay of the regular and the random, norms and deviations, routinized patterns and dramatic defamiliarizations. Despite this unique verbal richness, Lotman does not consider that poetry or literature can be defined by their inherent linguistic properties. The meaning of the text is not just an internal matter. It also inheres in the text's relation to wider systems of meaning, to other texts, codes, and norms in literature and society as a whole. Its meaning is also relative to the reader's horizon of expectations. Lotman has learned the lesson of reception theory well. It is the reader who, by virtue of certain receptive codes at his or her disposal, identifies an element in the work as a device. The device is not simply an internal feature, but one perceived through a particular code and against a definite textual background. One person's poetic device may be another's daily speech. It is obvious from all this that literary criticism has come a long way from the days when we had to do little more than thrill to the beauty of the imagery. What semiotics represents, in fact, is literary criticism transfigured by structural linguistics, rendered a more disciplined and less impressionistic enterprise, which, as Lotman's work testifies, is more rather than less alive to the wealth of form and language than most traditional criticism. But if structuralism transformed the study of poetry, it also revolutionized the study of narrative. Indeed, it created a whole new literary science, narratology, of which the most influential practitioners have been the Lithuanian agiogrammars, the Bulgarian Zvetan Todorov, and the French critics Gerard Genet, Claude Bremond, and Roland Barthes. The modern structuralist analysis of narrative began with the pioneering work on myth of the French structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who viewed apparently different myths as variations on a number of basic themes. Beneath the immense heterogeneity of myths were certain constant universal structures to which any particular myth could be reduced. Myths were a kind of language. They could be broken down into individual units or mythemes, which, like the basic sound units of language phonemes, acquired meaning only when combined together in particular ways. The rules which govern such combinations could then be seen as a kind of grammar, a set of relations beneath the surface of the narrative which constituted the myth's true meaning. These relations, Lévi-Strauss considered, were inherent in the human mind itself, so that in study a body of myth, we are looking less at its narrative contents than at the universal mental operations which structure it. These mental operations, such as the making of binary oppositions, are in a way what myths are about. They are devices to think with, ways of classifying and organizing reality, and this, rather than the recounting of any particular tale, is their point. The same Lévi-Strauss beliefs can be said of totemic and kinship systems, which are less social and religious institutions than networks of communication, codes which permit the transmission of messages. The mind which does all this thinking is not that of the individual subject. Myths think themselves through people rather than vice versa. They have no origin in a particular consciousness and no particular end in view. One result of structuralism, then, is the decentering of the individual subject, who is no longer to be regarded as the source or end of meaning. Myths have a quasi-objective collective existence, unfold their own concrete logic with supreme disregard for the vagaries of individual thought, and reduce any particular consciousness to a mere function of themselves. Narratology consists in generalizing this model beyond the unwritten texts of tribal mythology to other kinds of story. The Russian formalist Vladimir Propp had already made a promising start with his morphology of the folk tale, published in 1928, which boldly reduced all folk tales to 7 spheres of action and 31 fixed elements of functions. Any individual folk tale merely combined these spheres of action: the hero, the helper, the villain, the person sought for, and so on, in specific ways. Drastically economical as this model was, it was possible to reduce it even further. A.J. Gramsci's Semantic Structural, published in 1966, finding Propp's scheme still too empirical, is unable to abstract his account even further by the concept of an accent, which is neither a specific narrative, even nor a character, but a structural unit. The 6 accents of subject and object, sender and receiver, helper and opponent can subsume Propp's various spheres of action and make for an even more elegant simplicity. Zvetan Todorov attempts a similar grammatical analysis of Boccaccio's Decameron, in which characters are seen as nouns, their attributes as adjectives, and their actions as verbs. Each story of the Decameron can thus be read as a kind of extended sentence, combining these units in different ways. And just as the work thus comes to be about its own quasi-linguistic structure, so for structuralism, every literary work in the act of apparently describing some external reality is secretly casting a sideways glance at its own processes of construction. In the end, structuralism does not only think everything through again, this time as language. It thinks everything through again as though language were its very subject matter. The structuralist emphasis on the constructedness of human meaning represented a major advance. Meaning was neither a private experience nor a divinely ordained occurrence. It was the product of certain shared systems of signification. The confident bourgeois belief that the isolated individual subject was the fount and origin of all meaning took a sharp knock. Language predated the individual and was much less his or her product than he or she was the product of it. Meaning was not natural, a question of just looking and seeing, or something eternally settled. The way you interpret your world was a function of the language you had at your disposal, and there was evidently nothing immutable about these. Meaning was not something which all men and women everywhere intuitively shared and then articulated in their various tongues and scripts. What meaning you were able to articulate depend on what script or speech you shared in the first place. Well, that was about structuralism and its development in literary arena, and that's the development of its contribution in the development of literary theory. So what insights we take from structuralism is that literary texts are considered as structures, and it's a close associations with Russian formalism, or the Czech structuralism, or the French structuralism, developed into literature different forms of analysis and a break with the traditional interpretation of the text, which were mostly based on analytical or intuitive knowledge. So that's it for today. That is the end of the lecture. We'll see again next time. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.